This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Draft Lab knows that quality and consistency are your brewery's top priorities. Draft Lab provides easy-to-use sensory analysis tools designed to bring your tasting data into action. To start your free 2-week trial today, visit draftlab.com. That's DRAUGHT lab.com.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Barr, and I'm a sensory specialist at New Belgian Brewing Company and a co-founder of Draft Lab Sensory Software. I think that you really need to find the value of a sensory program from day one. The program doesn't exist to validate itself or to just train itself. The program needs to exist for a specific function. And I think the most important function, or at least the most risky thing that a brewery does, is release beer to the public to be consumed.
Has your brewery put off building a sensory program because it seems overwhelming? This week on the show, Lindsay Barr is here with the tips and baby steps you need to make immediate progress. We also take a peek under the hood of the ASBC Sensory Subcommittee and hear about some of the awesome new tools they've produced. Whether your brewery needs to start from scratch or already has a functional sensory program, this interview with Lindsay is sure to help you take things to the next level. Talk about some of the real obstacles small brewers face, as well as some of the common misconceptions that get in the way of sensory at the smallest breweries.
Having a sensory program doesn't really have to be terribly complicated, but a lot of the kind of barriers that I have seen is, of course, time, cost, and low number of panelists. A lot of the breweries that exist right now have 3 or 4 people that are running the entire show, and so you can't really run a statistically valid program with such low numbers. And of course, everybody is wearing many hats, so not one person has a lot of time to devote solely to the sensory program. So those are kind of the 3 main obstacles. There's also this misconception that it's very costly to run a sensory program, that it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to devote to the sensory program, but you can definitely do it on a shoestring budget. Really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is just make a decision based on flavor information. So sitting around a table and talking about the flavors of our beer is a good place to start, and that doesn't really cost anything. That's something that we actually just do anyway.
Yeah. Any other major obstacles that get in the way?
The time thing, I think, is a really big deal. A lot of breweries just really don't have a lot of time to devote to this. And what I would say is just to go ahead and take an hour a week. That can be just all it takes to just sit down, have a devoted time to really pick through the flavors of your beers with one another. At New Belgium, we run 2 panels a day, every day of the week, which takes up about half of every day. That said, we have 3 sensory analysts in the lab that are kind of like supporting this program, and we have about 30 panelists that are supporting that program as well. But it doesn't have to look like that. 1 hour a week sitting down and just making that a devoted time to really pick apart the brands is enough to be able to make some decisions off of flavor data.
You recently wrapped up a 5-year run as chair of the ASBC Sensory Committee. We're going to be talking about some of the new tools that have been produced by that committee, but first, give us a quick snapshot of who that committee is and what it does.
Yeah, so the sensory subcommittee is made up of a bunch of sensory analysts, specialists throughout the brewing industry, but not actually just the brewing industry. We have a couple of sensory folks that are involved just in the greater sensory world as consultants or working for raw materials organizations or different suppliers. Sensory really touches every consumable product. Anything that we touch, taste, smell usually has a sensory department that is supporting those products. So we have quite a few people that are actually just throughout the industry, not necessarily in beer. We have around 20 folks in the sensory subcommittee that devote some time to talking about the methods that they utilize and collaborating with one another to create methods that are specific for the brewing industry. So all of the methods that are in the sensory methods of analysis with the ASBC are all methods that exist widely in the sensory industry. They've just been adapted and adjusted to really be specific for the brewing industry. So a lot of them have been pared down from, these 30-page long documents to 3 pages and are really just very specific towards the brewing industry.
The committee recently published a sensory QA production release method. This is meant to be sort of an easy, final, true-to-brand test that breweries of any size could use, right?
Right. Yeah, that method was long overdue, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that it took us 5 years to finally publish that method. The methods of analysis, as it stands now, have a lot of really pretty complicated methods that are created for very specific purposes, and we failed to put a method together that was just, how do I release my beer? Like, how do I make sure that the beer that is going out of the door is free of off flavors and true to its brand intent? And so we finally created that. That was a collaboration with a few different medium-sized breweries in the industry, and we all kind of started talking about this and determined that we were more or less doing the same thing anyway, even though it wasn't necessarily documented anywhere. So we just put our heads together to publish and to document and publish a production release method. And it is called product release QA method.
It seems like this would be a great place to start if you're developing a new program and you need to start small, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you really need to find the value of a sensory program from day one. The program doesn't exist to validate itself or to just train itself. The program needs to exist for a specific function. And I think the most important function, or at least the most risky thing that a brewery does, is release beer to the public to be consumed. And if that beer is not what the brewer intended it to be, or if it has a defect, it can, really mar the reputation of a brewery and have a major impact on sales. So I think the first thing that breweries should be focusing on is that production release. And it's really, quite simple. When it comes down to it, it's just, how do I know what I'm making? What is the target that I'm going after? And then what are those normal limits of variation that I'm okay with seeing in this product? And then how do I know that I am hitting that target over and over and over again as I produce the same beer under the same brand and release that to the market?
I thought it was interesting in that method you really talk about, and you encourage people to use the true to brand nomenclature instead of sort of a no-go or go or no-go. Talk about that. I thought there was some interesting logic behind that.
Yeah, that was really intentional. We sensory scientists are very careful in the language that we use because we know that can really influence how a panelist sees the world and the kind of data that you're going to get from your panelist. So we're very intentional about using the kind of just neutral terminology like true to brand or true to target, rather than go, no go. Go, no go assumes that the panelist is actually making a decision. And they can really get in their heads when they say no go. They're thinking, okay, well, if I say no go, then that means that we're not going to release this beer. And that means that we're going to dump this beer. And that means that we're not going to get a profit sharing check. And that means that we're going under. And, that's what we tend to do with our brains. So we just try to take out all of the decision making from the panelist and just make it really simple. Like you're a trained person who knows what this brand is supposed to taste like. Is it that or is it not? Just very simply, this is what we're going for. Is it that or is it not? And if not, why? And then it's really up to the sensory analyst to determine what to do with that data. And we just don't want our panelists to assume that they are decision makers. They're just instruments that are giving us data, and they're one data point that we're going to look at more holistically when making a decision on what's going to happen, the disposition of that specific beer.
Talk a little bit more about that. A panelist might find that a beer is true to brand in some respects, but not in others. Tell us why that matters.
Yeah, so the full flavor profile of a beer isn't just, the aroma, or isn't just, the holistic flavor, and that's it. It can be picked apart into its various sensory attributes, its modalities of visual. So does it look like it should? Is the clarity correct? Is there foam? Is the color correct? So visually, is it what it should be? Aroma-wise, so orthonasally and retronasally, are you getting the attributes that make this brand this brand? So if the main key attributes of a beer is its citrusy and grassy characteristics, and you're looking for those in kind of a moderate magnitude, does the sample have those citrusy, grassy attributes in the proper intensity? So that's visual, aroma, and then taste is sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, metallic. There's a couple of different tastes. If a beer is supposed to be really bitter from the very beginning, that kind of dissipates into a moderate sweetness. Does this brand in front of you have that? And then mouthfeel. So is it properly carbonated? Is the acidity level proper? Is it, does the bitterness linger for too long? So the mouthfeel is another modality to kind of piece out. And then just kind of overall. So when you put those things together, is this brand recognizable as itself? So what you can do with that information when you break it down into those different modalities is you can really piece out, it might not smell proper, but the mouthfeel is right, the visual is fine, and the taste is fine. So then what is it that's kind of like making this aroma a little bit out? Is it just that it's a little bit too citrusy, or it's not citrusy enough? That might, beget a decision that is not so dire. But if it is, diacetyl or something that is causing this aroma to be out of spec, then that might actually be kind of a dumb situation. So it allows you to kind of understand the magnitude of the quote sensory fail. And it also helps you to be able to troubleshoot what is going on potentially with the process, rather than just saying, yes, it's what it should be, or no, it's not what it should be. If the answer is no, it's not what it should be, the next question should be why. And that information should make us all better brewers.
From the sensory scientist or analyst's point of view, once you've got true to brand data from a panel, how do you utilize that data?
Yeah, so once I have a solid target, and then I have the information on whether or not the specific sample we're evaluating is true to that target, I can then use that information to troubleshoot our process, which is kind of where training comes in. If a panelist just says, no, this isn't true to target, but doesn't really give you any information as to why, it doesn't help you to make adjustments in your process. So specifically with the production and release method, really the next step when you see something that is a little bit off, then you have to ask yourself another series of questions. What is off, and how am I going to answer that question? So I usually follow that up by using a couple of different methods. that we may not have time to go into. But if panelists' comments indicate that the citrus level is a little bit too high, I might do a scaling method on the heels of that to see how high is this citrus level. I might want to see if it is more aged than it should be, and I'll do like more of a scaling kind of method to understand the intensity and the magnitude of those issues. But really the first step is to understand whether the sample is within the normal levels of variation. And we can do that by using just some really simple statistics. A lot of breweries don't really have enough panelists to gain statistical validity in these results. We're just working with proportion data here. So yes, no, is it that or is it not? And if you don't have about 10 panelists that are evaluating these beers, then if one person says that it's not true to target and you have 2 people on your panel, that doesn't mean that 50% of the public at large is going to recognize this as a defect. So you really need more than 2 people to do stats. But the general stats are just control charts, and you can see where you normally are and whether or not the sample that you're tasting has more percent defect, a greater percent defect than you would typically see. We kind of account for about 20% of our panelists just saying that a beer isn't true to brand on a daily basis, and that's just the general noise that we're going to see. So if we see a significant amount more saying that it's off, then we have a real reason to react to that. So that's how we would do the stats. Like I said, a lot of breweries don't really have enough people to run stats. So what's really useful is once everybody just does their normal evaluation, to just sit around and talk about it. Like, okay, well, 3 of our 5 people said that this was a little bit high in citrus. How are we going to adjust for that in the future? Are we going to react to this really? Are we going to react to this dramatically? Are we going to dump this? Or is this something that we're comfortable releasing? At least capturing sensory information in a unbiased individual setting allows for discussions that wouldn't otherwise be had. If you're just kind of sitting around and drinking a beer with your coworkers, you're not really picking it apart. But if you're intentionally sitting down and picking it apart, it can spur on some discussions that will ultimately kind of help progress the betterment of the brewery in general.
20% seems like a lot of noise when you talk about that level of the staff rejecting something that's true to brand. Is that just because Sally has a cold today and Bob smoked a cigarette beforehand and somebody's just not on? I mean, how do you get that much noise in the process?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, beer is we all have our different limitations. We all have our sensitivities to various attributes that might show up in beer, and we all have our variable tolerance. So Sally might be like really not very tolerant of any kind of shifts in citrus flavor, but Bob kind of allows for a lot of citrus variation. And so we know that we have just inherent human to human variation. And that's a good thing. That means that, where Sally is not doing so great, Bob can pick up the slack. So having more panelists is always going to be better for the brewery. But yeah, that 20% is either going to be caused by actual beer variation or by panelist variation. And we try to minimize panelist variation as much as possible through constant training and standardization of the sensory lab so that we are pretty sure that we're getting solid results from everyone. But at the brewery, we know our panelists really well. We know what they are sensitive to, where their tolerance limits are. And so if I see, Bob flagging for something every single day, I know that that's probably just variation in Bob. And so I'll usually have just a conversation with him and try to get him back in line. So yeah, I mean, 20% is actually kind of reasonable if you have a panel of 10 or more, in my experience at least. And you do want your panelists flagging things pretty constantly. The last thing that you want is for panelists to just go into the booth and saying that everything is just fine, true to brand, pass. You want them to really be picking apart your beers, and then you can use that information however you please. So if 50% of your panel says that the beer is too citrusy, you might not decide to dump the beer, but you'll probably want to go back and look at the process. So you want to encourage your panelists to be verbose and to be pretty critical.
All right, I like it. So that's a good segue into, obviously if you want to have as many people on the panel as possible, and you've talked about the importance of training, let's talk about sort of the overhaul of Sensory 4 that your group took on. Why did you take that on? What did you want to accomplish there?
Yeah, so a little bit of background. Sensory 4 was just a panelist training and selection method in the methods of analysis for the ASBC. And that is a really big method. And how it stood, it was written 15 or so years ago. How it stood was basically just, having panelists evaluate a couple of different levels of sweetness and bitterness and using that as a means of selecting your panel. Not many panels really do that. And it's, in my opinion, it's really not that useful of information without having your panelists trained. We like to give our panelists a decent amount of training before we determine whether or not they are capable of having a seat on the panel. So we decided to just go ahead and blow up that method and actually break it up into 3 different methods. We originally started by just trying to modify what that method was, but it quickly became much bigger than we had intended it to be. So we broke it up into 3 different methods. One of them is just brand description generation and evaluation. So one of the main functions of a sensory program is product development. So how do I generate a description for the brands that I'm making? And then how do I evaluate those brands moving forward? So given the fact that that is one of the primary functions of a sensory lab, how do we need to train our panelists specifically to generate descriptions for these brands and how to evaluate these brands? So that method goes a lot into just lexicon generation. How do you develop a panelist's language and really harness their ability to describe a beer in an accurate way? And then how do we train them to evaluate a beer in the same manner moving forward? So that method is specific towards lexicon development and evaluating beer.
Coming up.
Panelists just can't have decision-making power. That's just what it comes down to. If you say that this isn't true to brand, if this is not on target, that does not mean that we're automatically going to open up the valve and send this to drain.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas.
This Master Brewers Podcast is proudly sponsored by Barna Mechanical, a full-service design build firm specializing in turnkey process and utility systems for the brewing industry. We partner with some of the best craft brewers in the U.S. to ensure the great beer they brew is what their customers get in every glass, bottle, can, or keg. You know beer. We know breweries.
Additional support provided by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Rocky Mountain meets at Miller Coors in Golden, Colorado, October 25th. The first weekend in November is a real trilemma for vendor reps. District Mid-Atlantic meets at DC Brow, District Mid-South meets at New Realm in Atlanta, and District Southern California meets at Anheuser-Busch in Los Angeles. The following week is busy in Canada with the Ontario Craft Brewers Conference November 7th and 8th, and District Eastern Canada in Montreal also on the 8th. District St. Paul, Minneapolis meets November 8th at Bad Weather Brewing in St. Paul. Also on the 8th, District Northern California is at Urban Roots Brewing and Smokehouse in Sacramento. The brand new District Northern Illinois is holding its inaugural meeting at Goose Island in Chicago, November 9th. Or if you're on the East Coast, I bet my buddy John Clegg wants to buy you a beer at District New England's fall meeting at Sebago Brewing on the same day. Just when you thought November couldn't get any busier, there's a HACCP course and a district meeting in Ontario on November 13th and 14th, and Districts Milwaukee and St. Louis both meet November 15th. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. What about establishing sensory techniques that will be used by the panelists, and to what extent does that come from the panelists themselves versus the person leading the program?
Yeah. So the instructions that we give have to be very consistent as panel leaders with our panelists. Analogous to running a chemistry method. You don't want one chemist coming in one day and preparing a sample differently than another chemist. You're going to get completely different results. So we try to train our panelists to be consistent throughout both of our breweries. We have two breweries, one in Asheville and one in Fort Collins, and we actually have the same exact training regimen between the two breweries so that we know that we're getting the same information to both of our panel groups. So the method that our panelists use to even evaluate beer is really crucial. If one person just guzzles a beer and uses that as their method of evaluation, and the other one is, smelling it in 4 different steps, then they're going to get different results. So the first thing that we do is train panelists how to evaluate a beer. And we also do that by breaking up each modality. So we train about what is the language around visual aspects of the beer? What's the language around the aroma aspects? And what we've done in the brewing industry is, we've been very analytical about how we evaluate for aroma and taste and mouthfeel and visual. And that has produced a lot of very jargony words that are sometimes hard to understand. And that's one of the things that makes starting a sensory program really intimidating, is this lexicon that is really chemical based. And I think that's a really great thing, to be able to call out ethyl butyrate rather than pineapple, for instance, or fruit juice, for instance. But what we do is we start by having our panelists really start to hone in their skills on identifying what it is they're experiencing. And then we move from identifying what they're experiencing to developing their language to be a little bit more analytical. So we want to start with fruit juice and calling that fruit juice. And then we hopefully are able to progress our panelist language to start calling out really specific chemical compounds, because that's really where we can get to some solid troubleshooting. If we know that we're looking at an ethyl butyrate situation, we can troubleshoot that a lot easier than we can a fruit juice situation.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It does. So one thing I thought that was interesting is in the method you point out that, a lot of people want to do visual first, but you really recommend moving that to the end. Why is that?
So we actually just recently started doing this at the brewery. One of our sensory analysts, Ellie, just kind of asked the question, why do we look at the beer first if we know that it's kind of biasing? We were seeing some very subtle color issues or color derivations between the two breweries and one of our brands, and we thought that was biasing our panelists to automatically call out other flavors that might have not been there. So instead of having our panelists automatically assume what a beer is going to taste like by looking at it, we ask them to evaluate visual last. If you look at a dark beer, you're going to assume that there's roasty, chocolatey, smoky aromas, and it actually might not be that at all. There might not be anything that is remotely roasty. It's the same reason why we don't give our panelists a pineapple sriracha beer and call it, this is a pineapple sriracha beer, because we would assume that they would call out both pineapple and sriracha, even when those attributes might not actually be there. So we basically want their unbiased feedback on the beer itself, and visual can be quite biasing and can lead to aroma evaluations that may not be consistent with what's actually going on in the beer. So we put visual last, and we don't give a lot of brand information if it's going to be biasing, like in the case of like a pineapple sriracha beer.
Yeah, and on a similar note, in addition to bias, you talk about how, in the method, how taste is often confused with other sensations in the mouth. And so the solution there is to have panelists plug their noses. I'll ask you the question that's in there. A lot of people say, well, that's not how consumers drink beer, so why should panelists do that?
Right. That's a really good call. Well, okay, let me address the taste thing. I think there's a few things going on with the misappropriation of our language in the specific modality of taste, mostly just because our language, we talk about this tastes like this, when really we're saying it smells like that. We're usually talking about aroma when we say it tastes like. So our language, we just automatically assume that taste is flavor. Which I'm not going to change how we speak in our culture. So that's not something that I want to address. But what we're trying to do in the sense, so taste is used as flavor usually in our language, and our taste can actually be influenced by aroma. So if you are smelling vanilla, that doesn't necessarily mean that the beer that you are tasting is sweet, but we tend to combine vanilla aroma with sweet taste, mostly because that's what we've seen. Vanilla is typically paired with cakes and cookies and ice creams, at least in the US. So we're actually not getting an accurate read on the level of sweetness of the beer if we're smelling aroma and allowing for that to influence the intensity of taste. So our main function as a sensory panel is to, alert to various process deviations, and also to, help in product development and troubleshoot and that kind of thing. So we don't necessarily have to be drinking consistent with how a consumer drinks, because we're really trying to use our fine-tooth comb to detect even the smallest deviations in our process so that we can go back and kind of fix those before a consumer notices. So, of course, panel data, like that's why I say not every single panel fail needs to result in a dump, because a lot of times what we're seeing might not have any kind of consumer impact. And we might decide to go ahead and release that beer, but we'll go back and look at our process to see if we can be a little bit more consistent and a little bit better.
That makes so much sense. I've unfortunately been a part of so many panels, years ago, where the idea was, okay, everybody here has the power to pump the brakes on this right now, and of course, like you said, nobody wants to be the one who makes that call, knowing the ramifications of that, and I think you just don't get the same results.
Yeah, exactly. Panelists just can't have decision-making power. That's just what it comes down to. And we tell our panelists that, if you say that this isn't true to brand, if this is not on target, that does not mean that we're automatically going to open up the valve and send this to drain. We're going to do our due diligence. We're going to understand what kind of consumer impact this may or may not have. And we have reams and reams of data that kind of show if something is going to have an impact on consumers. So the decision making power needs to really be with the sensory department and the brewing team.
Yeah, and another important point that the method brings up too is in regards to bias too is just making sure that people aren't shooting each other expressions and glances and facial expressions. I mean, that's a kind of an obvious thing, but that's something that is going to have a big influence.
Yeah, absolutely. I as best as possible, the first thing that our panels need to do is put in their own individual, unbiased evaluation into the beer. And any way that they can do that is encouraged. So, the booth setting is absolutely ideal. But a lot of small breweries don't have the space and don't have the money to be able to, put in booths. So I'm all about the round table, because a round table is just a shape. But the round table has gotten a really bad name because it usually means that everybody is influencing one another, and there's this kind of like halo effect going on. And you can sit at a round table, do your individual evaluation, and try to just respect one another's evaluation, and then you can come together and have a discussion about it. But yeah, it's all about putting on that poker face, so that you can get really individual results and have every panelist's voice heard in the evaluation. And that really just comes down to respecting the process and respecting your individual panelists, even if you're evaluating in the same room. There just have to be norms in the sensory lab. The sensory lab can be the bar before you open, and it can be at a round table. But there just have to be some norms around, not talking to one another, not influencing one another's evaluation, and taking as many measures as possible to keep that bias as low as possible.
I noticed the method points out that the number of years someone's worked in a brewery really has nothing to do with their sensory abilities. Talk about that.
That's absolutely true. We're constantly recruiting new panelists in our lab, and they're really the lifeblood. It's really great to have panelists that have been around for 15 years, so long as they are continuously keeping up on training, and so long as they're continuously engaged. But really, you just need your panelists to be invested in the product that you're making. I mean, luckily, we're not making cat food, and we're making beer, so it's really easy to be passionate about it and to be invested in the outcome of the product. But so long as your panelists are just engaged in what they're doing and willing to learn and able to be kind of humble throughout the process, they're going to give you some really good data. And so actually, some of our newest panelists are actually some of the best. They've not really been trained to look at beer in one way. After you've been doing this for a while, you kind of can get a bit of a rigid mindset about what beer flavor is. But new panelists will come in with a totally new set of eyes, and through their lens, they're able to add descriptors to the conversation that are maybe completely new to the panel in general. And we tend to get really pigeonholed in our own language. A few years ago, we started making cider at the brewery, and a lot of our beer panelists had the hardest time coming up with descriptors that were just a little bit further from appley. So what we did is we recruited totally new panelists that didn't have a language that was just built on beer, and they were able to give us a much clearer lens on what we were producing in another category. So we always have new panelists coming in, and they definitely add a lot to the story, and sometimes are the most enthusiastic and best panelists.
That's cool. I can't stop thinking about how glad I am that I don't have to be on a sensory panel for cat food. So,
right? Isn't it great?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on and talk about sort of another part of Sensory 4 that's new, and that's the training method for descriptive analysis. Tell us about what that is.
Yeah, so descriptive analysis is a really pretty advanced technique. It's a technique really used to identify to quantify the rate and the intensity of each attribute in a sample. And if your panelists don't really understand the attributes that are already in the sample, it's really not possible to get consistent data on the intensity of those attributes. So descriptive analysis is really a method that I don't encourage a lot of breweries to use, especially right away, especially because you're using scaling data. And if you don't have 10-ish people that are sitting on your panel, you're going to get a lot of noise. If somebody rates something at a 10 and the other person rates something at a 1, are you going to average that data and really say that the intensity is around a 5? Like, no, that's not solid data. The descriptive analysis training method talks a lot about that. A lot of the pitfalls that I've seen breweries get into by just jumping straight into using scaled data. But it also gives you a good idea of how to execute this properly. So we go through panelist selection. It usually requires, really highly trained panelists. About 15-ish is typical, and they need to have a decent amount of training. So one of the reasons why descriptive analysis is a difficult technique to apply is it requires a lot of training. We say, or the literature says, around 5-ish hours per project should be applied for training. Some studies even suggest that training benefit peaks around 60 hours, and I can guarantee you no brewery is training their panelists for 60 hours. So we go through training on how to both identify different attributes and how to get alignment on scale use. So we do that pretty publicly at the brewery. We give panelists various attributes and tell them basically what the intensity is to try to maintain some kind of calibration. And then we have them go on about and scale different attributes. How we apply this at the brewery is really just for troubleshooting. So our first step is to do that production release method. So here's the target. Is it that or is it not in visual, aroma, taste, mouthfeel, and overall? And then if the answer is no, it's not that, then we'll do some descriptive analysis. So if I have an indication that citrusy is too high, then I will throw citrusy in the mix of various attributes that the panelist is then asked to scale. So we don't use this for quality assurance technique. We'll usually use this for troubleshooting and maybe some brand development if intensity information is required.
All right. How about let's get into that third and final part of Sensory 4. So that's going to be the training method that's QA and production focused. Talk about that.
This is what you would typically call attribute training. Most people are pretty familiar with attribute training. Essentially, you're just going to spike known levels of various food grade standards into beer that could potentially arise throughout the process. And this information gives the sensory analysts the ability to go back and troubleshoot the process. So if your panelists are trained on diacetyl and they know what it is and they can call it out, it's useful for the program so that you know if you see diacetyl that it really is diacetyl, and you know how to go back in the process and fix that. So really every attribute that we train on has some kind of a root cause and kind of has an action tied to it so that we can go back in the sensory department and talk with our brewing team and maybe suggest some various changes or call out something that may have happened in process that should be addressed. So this method goes through attribute recognition, how to spike beers, how to track panelist progression, how to report on their performance, and it suggests some targets that panelists should be working towards to improve their attribute recognition. And I'm kind of glad that you ended with asking about this method because this is actually a method that a lot of breweries are using. and maybe using even too intensely. This is like, the only way that panelists are trained. But it really gives you a good idea of how to identify defects. But this doesn't really help you develop a language that is going to help brewing develop new products. So if we are only focused on attribute recognition, the targets that we're going to come up with are going to be riddled with jargon and maybe even defects if that's the language that they've been taught to use. So we also need to balance this out with using analogy as part of their language development so that they can create descriptions for IPAs that are not necessarily saying like ethyl butyrate with a little bit of T2N and a slight amount of ethyl hexanoate. You want your panelists to say there's, strong amounts of floral aroma followed by citrusy, orange peel, and guava juice. Like that's more of a useful brand target than just chemical attributes. So this has to really be paired with that first method that we talked about for training with the intent of brand description and evaluation.
Your method also helps people understand what they should do with the data, right?
Yeah. So we go through, and it's a pretty short method. It's still like 7 pages, so you can't go through too much in 7 pages. But it gives a good idea of how do you report on panelist performance, and how do you just manage the data that you're going to get. It's really not enough for a panelist to say, I've seen diacetyl and therefore I know what diacetyl is. Until you're actually tracking your panelist data, you can't really utilize that information that they're going to be giving you. For example, if you've spiked diacetyl 10 times and someone has seen it 10 times, but they've never gotten it correct, and then they say diacetyl on panel, you're probably not going to want to use that information. You're going to want to take it with a big grain of salt. So really that attribute data isn't really that useful in the panel setting unless you are tracking it, unless you know what your panelists are capable of smelling and what they're not capable of smelling. So yeah, it goes through how to collect some data, how to store that data, and then how to communicate that to your panelists.
One thing I didn't ask that I wanted to, in regards to the True to Brands test, how do you deal with that when it comes to new brands? Because so many breweries are constantly releasing new brands. How do you approach True to Brand for something that's brand new?
That's a really good question, and it requires a different test altogether because there really isn't a brand that's established. And we're, New Belgium is in the same boat. We're creating a lot of different beers all of the time. And sometimes we'll see a brand once or twice. And so asking the True to Brand question isn't really that useful. So we actually just kind of changed the terminology. What we do is we sit down with the brewers, whoever is creating this beer, and we just ask them to, when they're developing the recipe, to write down what their intent is. So why are you adding caramel malt and Saaz hops? You're probably looking for a little bit of a darker color and some residual sugar and sweetness, and you're looking for like a spicy noble character. Boom. You just wrote a brand description based on what you were using to develop that recipe. So we ask them to generate a target based on what they're going for. And then we have our panelists evaluate the beer without having the target in front of them, just unbiased. Here's a beer. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? What does it look like? And then they're able to evaluate that, the beer unbiased. And then they're given that target description at the end and are told, this is what the brewer was going for. Did they achieve that or not? So it's a little bit of a different take on the True to Brand test, or the True to Target test, by basically having panelists generate a description without any information about the beer, and then you can compare that description to what the brewer intended and see whether or not they hit it.
And then how quickly can you transition that to a True to Brand? I mean, do you say, okay, we've brewed this 3 times now and evaluated 3 times, now we're going to do now we're going to say it's true to brand, or how fast does that work?
Yeah, I think we should always allow for a little bit of a dial-in period when we're scaling up a brand. So it can be difficult to go from a brewer's intent to a perfect scale up on the first try. So we need to allow for a little bit of tweaking to happen. So we would do that method, just a describe method. If you're using Draft Lab, it's just called the describe method. If you would use that method probably about, like you said, about 3 times, or until you really think that you have dialed in what that brand is going to be at full scale. And then you can lock that description in and then start asking the question of whether or not the subsequent samples are true to that brand. So yeah, I think you need a little bit of time to dial it in for your panelists to understand that brand, and to generate a description that allows for a certain amount of variability in the process.
Okay, great. In addition to the overhaul of Sensory 4, the Sensory Subcommittee published a couple of methods for evaluation of raw materials. Tell us about those.
Yeah, I'm really proud of these methods. We first of all had to come up with a way of validating that these methods are repeatable and sensitive. So the first method that we published is called the hot steep method, and that is a malt sensory method. Cassie from Breeze was really integral in creating this method, and we did a lot of beta testing at New Belgium, and my friend Andrea at Valley Malt also did a lot of beta testing, Anna as well from Highland did a lot of beta testing, and we just tried to dial in what this method would look like and how we could do this repeatably. So a few years ago, we've validated that this method is both repeatable and sensitive, meaning that if 2 different sensory analysts prepared the wort for this method, that you would get the same results. So it's repeatable. And then it's sensitive. So we would take 2 malts that have just very little differences between them, and is the method sensitive enough to where panelists can detect those differences when the malt flavor is extracted in a certain way. So the hot steep method was really created with malt sensory in mind. It's different from the Congress in that you get a wort that's about a 5 Plato. With Congress, it's much sweeter, and the Congress, you're really just trying to understand what is the maximum extract that you can get from that sample. This was created with just
sensory in mind,
sensory in mind, yeah. So,
and I'll encourage listeners that want to learn more about that to listen to episode 42, because we did talk about that a bit with Cassie, and it's a really interesting and very practical method that I've used recently, and it really is powerful. So you had the hot steep method for malt, but then you also have a raw materials method that's new for hops. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, so this one's new. This is called the hop grind method. It was developed by Tim Kosleski at Haas many years ago, and it's really simple. It's almost kind of like comical how simple it is. You basically grind hops and you put them in a jar and you smell them. But we wanted to be as thorough as possible in calling this an ASBC validated method. So we did the same kind of testing to make sure that it was both repeatable and sensitive. What we found is that it is a more sensitive method for whole cone hops than it is for pellets. So with pellets, you can absolutely use it to determine differences between varieties, but you're probably not going to be able to piece out nuances within a variety. And if you use cones, you can do that. So this method is going to be published. I don't think it's yet on the MOA, but it will be published very soon. It's simply, you grind up hop material, put it in a really tight sealed jar, and you smell it, and you can detect various aroma attributes. So I've been using that for a while, and the industry has really been using that method for a while, and finally we just put some robust testing around it and published it as an official method recently.
That was Lindsay Barr here on the Master Brewers podcast. By the way, Lindsay developed a great free app that your team can use to build brand descriptions for your beers right from your smartphone. See how it works at draftlab.com or by clicking the DraftLab logo in the show notes. Hey, remember the Belgian beer book that Sten Mertens and Jan Stencils talked about on episode 101, The Yeasts of Tomorrow? Well, great news. It's now available in the Master Brewers bookstore. Just go to mbaa.com/store and type Belgian beer into the search bar to get your copy today.
One day, like everyone else did. Calm down, I'm moving too fast. And then I hit on the ground. Just like that one day when we came